on Facebook, Twitter, and our subreddit forum, where THC fans and the cerebral adventurers of the counterculture have taken refuge, and discuss the finer points of our never-ending struggle to tip the scales in favor of truth, peace, and enlightenment in a war-torn, corrupt, and shady world. Let the games begin.
In the 1930s, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed the nation through a series of radio broadcasts known as the Higherside Chats. His aim was to reassure the common man that our society would recover from its troubled times. But we're far from 1930, and I deal with a different kind of fire. For a new era of worldly frustration, we offer a fresh conversation. I'm Greg Carlwood, and these are the Higherside Chats.
How's it going, Higherside Chatters? From sunny San Diego, I'm your humble host, Greg Carlwood, and there's never been a more appropriate episode to drink a little drink and smoke a little smoke in defiance of the massive multi-generational propaganda campaign against my favorite consumable pastimes. This is a great show. There's a lot of awesome, practical information in here on a crucial topic, and I feel like anyone who's having a hard time financially should really pay attention to the possibilities. This could help them out a lot, as well as anyone who just wants to stick it to the oil companies, the Rockefeller lineage, the IRS, and the international bankers all at the same time, all while improving their own situation, costs of living, and much more. It's a bigger deal than it might seem on the surface, and powerful people have spent billions of dollars to sway your mind one way, and we want all that spending to be in vain. It's pretty cheap to tell people the truth, but the lies, that's what's expensive. So listen carefully to the man with the plan, the dude who beat crude, and right on the other side of this little THC ditty done by one of the listeners named Sean, we'll be talking with David Blume.
I walk on the higher side. I walk on the higher side. UFOs carry the elite, while cryptids sprinkle fairy dust, we call it DMT. The machine elves capture the layout of the rapture. We can't let leprechauns get the gold that they're after. Blackout children come around and they give you the creeps. Greg Carlwood chillin' with a gang of big feet. I could say that is that in a reptilian pope hat, but I'd rather get started on a higher side chat. What? Greg, where you at?
I am right here, and a big thanks to Sean for that one. But alright folks, today we're going to uncover yet another area of manipulation and try to undo some of the damage that the good old Rockefeller propaganda has done to our culture yet again, and this time in the area of energy and fuel. You know, we've heard about these so-called new fuel options the past few years with ethanol or E15 or E85, and we really don't know what that is. It can get pretty confusing, and the long history of manipulation and lies only makes it worse, but the situation with oil and gasoline is one of the most serious on the planet today, and when you hear just how simple and empowering the solutions can be, you're going to have a whole new reason to loathe the nefarious elite. So let's clear up that confusion and provide a little ethanol enlightenment with our guest David Blume, one of the leading experts on the topic, and he has been educating people on it probably longer than I've been alive. He's the author of the book Alcohol Can Be a Gas, and is featured heavily in a new documentary called Pump, aimed at this subject as well, which premieres in New York and LA this very weekend. It's fascinating stuff, and I think you're really going to be blown away, so let's do the damn thing. David Blume, welcome to THC.
Hey, welcome, Greg. Glad to be here.
Yeah, man, thanks for doing this. I know that over the years I've failed to educate myself about fuel because it always just seemed boring and kind of confusing. There's a lot of propaganda out there. And when I learned about your work, I was pretty shocked. And being primarily a conspiracy show, we know that entire populations are often undermined for the profits of a few, and it happens more than anyone would like to admit. But to get us started, why don't you tell us about the real history here with alcohol and gas? Because the truth is we've had a solution longer than we've even had a problem, right, David?
Well, yes. If when you think about it for a minute, it wasn't like we discovered gasoline and said, wonder if we have an engine that would run on that, and the engines came first and they ran on other things before gasoline was invented. And that other thing was plain old 100% moonshine. So alcohol was the first fuel before gasoline was ever invented. And it was used first for internal combustion engines in mines where you couldn't have toxic exhaust. And then automobiles picked up alcohol. and continued into the future. The Model T was an alcohol vehicle, which was later able to run on gasoline. But Henry Ford was a total advocate of alcohol fuel because, well, you may have heard Ford's famous saying, if my workers can't afford my car, then it's too expensive. Mm-hmm. And so, he looked at that time, 60% of the country was involved in agriculture. So his first vehicles were tractors and then cars. And, they all ran on alcohol at that time because that's not just what was available, but that's what was affordable. So as time moved on, there was this fella named Rockefeller who came along who was making his money replacing whale oil for lamps with kerosene. So he'd boil up oil and he'd get the heavy stuff, the kerosene for lighting and heating, and he'd throw away all the volatile, nasty stuff by dumping it in rivers at night. And so, people didn't like that too much, especially when the river caught on fire, So, but Rockefeller figured out that if he fussed around with the car enough, he could get it to run on that volatile stuff instead of alcohol. And since it was a waste product from his other industry, he could undercut the price of alcohol in the market. So after a bit of time, the market was split between city fuel, which was gasoline, and what was sold in the countryside was alcohol. And basically, you had to have a car that would go between the two. So if you drove out in the country and there were no gas stations then, you had to stop by a farm and buy a jug of alcohol to put in your tank and then switch and come on back to the city. So for a long time, there was quite a tussle in the market between the two fuels.
Man, it is just such a fascinating story. And I mean, I think a lot of people would be shocked to hear that ethanol was around right in the beginning. I mean, I know I was. And then as Rockefeller wanted to kind of corner this market, I mean, that's kind of what fueled the whole prohibition thing, isn't it?
That's right. I went to the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn and researched this because I had heard it was true. And what I found was that Rockefeller conducted an enormous campaign against alcohol in the early part of the 1900s. And basically, he just decided he didn't want 50% of the market. He wanted the whole market, which is basically the goal of capitalism, right, is monopoly. So Rockefeller went after alcohol by demonizing it as a drug, basically saying that alcohol was the root of all evil. And what he did is he hired the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, a group of crazy old ladies, that used to go into bars with umbrellas and beat people about the head saying, lips that touch alcohol will never touch mine. And, you can imagine how fringy these people were. And yet, given millions of dollars by Rockefeller, they were able to walk into Congress and buy off Congress to make alcohol illegal for all purposes. But you got to understand, this wasn't just passing a bill. This was passing a constitutional amendment. So for the viewers out there who forgot their civics classes, that's a 2/3 majority. Now, you got to imagine this was done in the early 1900s, and women didn't even vote yet when this was passed. So you can't even say all the little old ladies passed this thing. It was sheer economic bribery that had hard-drinking Congress vote against alcohol. And it destroyed alcohol for about 20 years as a fuel in the United States and caused the destruction of literally billions of dollars worth of alcohol-producing equipment around the United States. And so for a while, Rockefeller had the whole market to himself, and we became a gasoline-guzzling country.
Huh. It's so funny to hear this because, I'm not naive. I know that money is behind everything, but I guess I'd just been led to believe that prohibition was the one time that government wanted to crack down on something for the betterment of society. And man, how naive I was. Well, why should this situation be any different?
Well, that's the thing. People say, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. And when something happens, you're either a conspiracy theorist or you're a coincidence theorist. Crap just happens. So basically, if something big happens, people work on it to make it happen. And if they work together or breathe together, which is the meaning of conspiracy, that's what happens. And so basically, it's more an expression of organization versus coincidence when we talk about how government and corporations work together to make something happen for the benefit of the corporations.
Yeah. And on a show called THC, we got to point out, this is almost a direct parallel to the marijuana hemp issue. The plant was made illegal because it was a threat to big business and because people could harvest it on their own pretty easily. Again, it's not about the consumption of the quote-unquote drug. Both products just happen to be great at taking the edge off, but it's about getting in the way of huge corporate profits. And it's frustrating and really sad when you hear the true story.
Well, now you know how they developed the strategy to stop hemp from being in the market. It was a repeat of prohibition and alcohol. They demonized hemp as a drug, which it was practically just rope at the time, and then had it prohibited. And so the playbook they worked from, and corporations reuse what works over and over again. They're not the most creative bunch. So it worked for alcohol, and they made it work for hemp. And just like in the case of alcohol, only the United States fell for it. Rockefeller went after France and Germany and all these other places to prohibit alcohol. And they all said, you must be kidding. Prohibit wine? Prohibit beer? You must be nuts. And so only the United States bought the propaganda.
Just go figure, And I've also heard you tell an interesting anecdote about World War II. The Germans used alcohol as their fuel, right? It kind of came into play with our strategy.
Well, Germany was really different than the United States. Germany had a lot of coal, but they had no oil. So basically, Germany ran its entire economy on alcohol. All the vehicles ran on it, the trucks ran on it, the planes ran on it. And Germany was a powerhouse in the world because it was exporting alcohol engines and alcohol equipment and tractors and everything all around the world. Locomotives they made running on alcohol. So that was the national fuel in Germany in the early part of the 1900s. And when it came to World War II, it was what powered the whole German economy then too. You have to realize in Germany, they had the same problem there that we have in the United States today. They had huge surpluses of agriculture. Now, here it's corn. We have way too much corn. There they had way too much potatoes. Mm-hmm. And so there were 77,000 cooperative distilleries around Germany processing surplus potatoes into alcohol. As we all know, if you make potatoes into alcohol, it's vodka, right? If you make corn into alcohol, it's whiskey. But the alcohol is the same in both cases. So when it came to World War II, our strategists thought, all right, well, we'll find Germany's 2 or 3 refineries, we'll bomb those, and then we can go back to business. Well, Germany didn't have any refineries, so they had to bomb 77,000 community distilleries to end the war. Took them 4 years. Huh. So in terms of anti-terrorism or national security, the best thing you can do is have thousands of alcohol distilleries because you can't be cut off of energy or fuel. And Germany wasn't. So in the Nuremberg Accords following World War II, they were prohibited from establishing an alcohol fuel system again. Huh. So that's how bothersome, having those darn farmers in charge of the energy supply instead of a handful of oil corporations.
Man, it's just so interesting to hear that alternative side of things. And going back to Prohibition for a minute, since it was, about the fuel side of things and not at all about the consumption, once Prohibition ended, did the government keep the fuel side of the law in place?
No, the fuel side took off like a rocket because we were in the early Depression near the 30s in the United States, and farmers were the most hard hit. And so we had a huge surplus of farm product because World War I had generated a big demand for wheat and stuff. And so basically after that war, which was roughly the time that Prohibition started, it was a double hammer to the farmers. They had increased their production, and then their market went away. So after Prohibition, farmers started making alcohol like crazy. We had one company called Agrol, which had over 2,000 stations throughout the Midwest, and it sold blends of alcohol and pure alcohol at the pump. And the oil companies, to get rid of this new movement toward alcohol again, did the first media saturation bombing. So what happened in the case of Agrol is that the oil companies hand-delivered, because there was no internet, there were no fax machines, hand-delivered press releases to every radio station and every newspaper in the country. And what the press releases said was, the Agrol company wasn't helping American farmers. It was getting Caribbean molasses and making alcohol and taking advantage of the positive, spin that farmers were providing this, and they were really traitors to the country. Well, at that time, people believed everything that the press said. And so everyone boycotted Agrol, and in 30 days, they were out of business. So the oil companies have become masters at using the media to discredit and otherwise destroy alcohol fuel in this 100-year war that they've been in between farmers and themselves. So, in fact, I was talking to someone here at the premiere the other night here at Pump, the movie, which is about alternative fuels. And I was talking to her because she's in the PR business. And I said, well, tell me, what's the largest PR firm in the world? And she named one. And I said, not even close. The largest PR firm in the world is the American Petroleum Institute. And it's bigger than the top 3 PR firms put together. So when the API cranks up to mess with alcohol, it's a tidal force. It's like a tidal wave coming in across the media. And that's why you haven't heard about this stuff before.
Yeah, I mean, you'd wonder why they would need such a huge PR firm, and now we're starting to realize that they've had to keep this secret. I mean, what about the big what about the big energy crisis during the Carter presidency? Did alcohol fuel make any kind of rebound during that?
Well, that was the since World War II, that was the big resurgence of alcohol. Carter was righteously angry that the American oil companies raised their prices to the same prices as the Arab embargo countries. In other words, the Arabs had decided our support of Israel needed to be punished, and so they cut off the oil. Basically to show everyone that they were in charge and that we had to stop funding Israel. And people in this country, for the first time, had to wait in line. They were rationed. They could only get fuel every other day, and then only 10 gallons. People in this country were not used to having their freedom to have fuel curtailed, and there was a tremendous amount of anger, which Carter understood. And so he slapped on a 50 cent a gallon windfalls profit tax against the oil companies, and then gave all that money to develop alternative energy. And alcohol blossomed again all across the country in the 1980s, late 1970s. And, thousands of companies got started then.
Man, I'm learning more every minute. So tell us about your personal journey, because I know you've been involved a lot in empowering self-sustaining areas over the years, and you've been trying to teach about these things for a long time. When did you first learn about this?
Well, I first learned about it in college, back in the dark ages of the early 70s. And I learned about it from an ecology professor. My profession is as an ecologist and biosystematist. So I learned in an offhand way, just a comment in a class as we saw a bottle of beer fermenting and we're talking about it. A big 5-gallon bucket of bottle of beer fermenting, where the teacher said, that stuff would run your car. And I totally didn't believe him. So I went to the library and figured, I'm going to find out there has never been anything other than gasoline. Ha! And I was shocked. There was this gigantic hidden history of alcohol that nobody was talking about. So that's how I got hooked. And when the gas crisis hit, I started working for Mother Earth News, which back in the day was the alternative energy, appropriate technology think tank, and published a magazine. So I and a couple of other guys ran the alcohol fuel division of Mother Earth News, and we published distillery plans, and we distributed them all over the country in the hundreds of thousands. And people were making alcohol all over the country with our plans. So it was, gasoline had gone way up. People were really motivated. And it was a very worrisome time for the oil companies.
And eventually with this, as you went along, you eventually ran into some legal trouble, didn't you?
Well, the legal trouble came about because the oil companies had mobilized into fighting alcohol. And so because I had taught a couple of hundred workshops on how to make alcohol over a period of years, the PBS came to me and said, hey, let's take your workshop and make it into a TV series. And so it was 10 half-hour shows, took 2 years to produce, and we wrote a book to go along with it, which is the precursor to my modern version, Alcohol Can Be a Gas. And it went on the air in San Francisco. 130 PBS stations were signed up to air it after the premiere. And during the premiere, I was at the printer getting the book printed. This is all before desktop publishing, right? This was actual photographs and ruby lith and red windows and, physical paste up of a book. So anyway, we're up there getting the book printed, and all of a sudden we get a call to stop the presses. And when I call KQED, I find out that they're letting the premiere finish, but they canceled the distribution to the other 120 or so stations that were supposed to air the show. And what happened was Chevron called them up and said, we don't understand. We thought you liked our money. And why is that on the air? And they just canceled it immediately. So anyways, all the facts of that got discovered in a 3-year lawsuit I filed against KQED and the oil companies. But, they had lots of money and big lawyers, and they were able to keep the thing suppressed. But, it's out now. It's bad for them.
Right. And if I remember correctly, you had done some distilling of your own, which is a big no-no in this area, or at least it was in the late 80s, right?
Yeah, at Mother News, we looked into it and we found that there was no legal way to make distillation products in the United States. You could just barely make wine or beer, and only in small batches. There were no brew pubs, nothing like that. And that was all a throwback to the Prohibition era, where alcohol was highly, regulated. So those laws were still on the books, and in that day, there was something called the Government Printing Office, which as a citizen and a taxpayer, you could order anything that the government published for free. And it was all hard copy.
Wow.
So we went ahead and went to the government printing office and got the entire library of regulations of the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. It stood about 4 feet tall on the floor of the apartment we were working on this in. So we got a keg of beer and we said, we're going to find this thing. We're looking for an exception to the rules somewhere in the regulations that would let us distill alcohol. So here we were going through page at a time, 4 of us looking for the thing. And about halfway through the stack, which was good because if we would have had any more beer, we would have never gotten any further anyway. There it was, the experimental distiller's license. And I look at that and I go, oh, this is the wedge we use to drive it in. So what it said was, if you were a corporation that wanted to try something different or new, you didn't have to fill out the $100,000 worth of paperwork for a beverage license. You could file this simple form and be able to do your experiments, Mm-hmm. So I filled it out, I sent it in, and we got it back, all approved. And it, only cost $100.
Nice.
Quite amazing. So we already had our still built, of course. We were already playing with it. So we called up the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms people and said, hello, we have a still over here. We're making fuel, and like the next day, a SWAT team shows up, the ATF shows up, and I get hauled off in handcuffs. But we called the press before they showed up. So the whole thing was, reported and filmed. So the next morning when I, have to go before the judge, I was surrounded by the press in the courtroom. And so here I am standing there with handcuffs behind me. And the judge says, well, Mr. Blume, it seems like there's not much to discuss here. You had a distillery, and we presume that means you were going to make alcohol for it. So you seem to be guilty. And he says, do you have anything to say about that? Because I went there to defending myself without a lawyer. And I said, Your Honor, I do have a statement. And there's a precedent, actually, about this. And he goes, well, what's that, Mr. Blume? And I said, well, you see, back in England in the 1700s, they arrested a chemist for having a distillery. And the judge says, Mr. Blume, you're trying my patience, 1700s? I said, well, bear me out, Your Honor. So I said, yeah, this guy got busted for having a distillery. And the judge said the very same thing. You have a distillery, so we presume you're guilty. And it's because you have the equipment in your possession. And the young chemist said, well, in that case, Your Honor, I have another crime to confess to. And the judge says, well, what is it? And he said, well, I have to confess to rape. And the judge says, great Scott, did you rape somebody? And the chemist said, no, but I have the equipment in my possession.
That's so good.
So my judge says, Mr. Blume, there will be no levity in my courtroom. And the whole press started laughing at that comment. But I then said, well, Your Honor, can you have the bailiff pull this piece of paper out of my back pocket? And so they take paper out of my back pocket because I couldn't get to it. I was handcuffed. And they brought it up to the judge, and the judge opens it up and looks at it, and he goes, my God, this man has a distillery permit. I said, that's right. Take these cuffs off. I'm walking out. And that's what happened. But that wasn't the end of it. We wrote an article about it. We published it around the country, how to get your own permit and what happened to me. And 250,000 people applied for the permit. Now, you'd think, government can handle that. But there were only 3 guys in the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms office to process these permits. So they come into work, and the entire office is full from floor to ceiling with sacks of mail. So this caused me to be called up before Congress. Remember, this is the oil crisis, And the head of the ATF was called up before Congress, and the senator who was in charge of the hearing was George McGovern. So for those of you who weren't part of the 60s and 70s, George McGovern was really, for Congress, a real radical Democrat. I mean, he tried to stop the Vietnam War. He was a good guy. So anyway, he has us both up there in Congress, and he goes to the ATF director and says, "Can you explain to me why you're stopping patriotic Americans from making alcohol to power their cars instead of buying Arab oil?" Well, the guy who's standing there is just a bureaucrat. He's not used to a senator calling him out on the carpet, so sputtering there. And McGovern turns to me and says, "Well, do you have an answer to this, Mr. Blume?" And I said, "Your Honor, I have actually a pretty simple to follow piece of paper here, which would be a pretty good model for a permit the ATF could use to register all the stills. And it's only a page and a half." And so they take it up to McGovern. He goes, "Well, that looks good." And he turns to the ATF guy and says, "You think that's good enough?" And the ATF guy would have agreed to anything at that point to get out of the room. So that permit is still pretty much unchanged till today. You can make your own alcohol based on the permit I wrote, and you can make up to 5,000 gallons a year. The permit is free, and it's really easy to fill out.
Wow. So, yeah, it's so crazy that there would be such a loophole in the system, but it's really not surprising when you find that it's originally there for corporate purposes. They're the only ones who you think would use it.
That's right. So the history is really cool. There's much, much more history. But, the point was that it's been a struggle between alcohol and the people that control fossil fuel for a long time, because alcohol can be used for more than running a car. We can run generators with it. In fact, General Electric, its great big turbine generators are certified for alcohol fuel, and they didn't have to have anything replaced to do that. They, are already able. Locomotives can run on alcohol, as the Germans proved. They sold alcohol locomotives to Egypt that were just fine. Airplanes in Brazil run on alcohol, and we, as we said, the whole German Air Force ran on alcohol in World War II. So there are many things to use it for, but the most important thing might not even be cars. The most important thing that actually affects half the world, 3.5 billion people, is cooking. Because those people, that 3.5 billion people, they cook with wood or kerosene indoors. And so the huge health toxicity of breathing any kind of smoke, whether it's wood or kerosene, is immense. And so you're looking at 4 or 5 million women a year who die from breathing that smoke just while they're cooking. In fact, Hillary Clinton went into one of these huts during her time, and she's choking on the smoke in the woman's house in this little hut. And she goes to the wall with her fingers and can scrape carbon right off the walls.
Huh.
Those are the same thing as people's lungs, right? Being covered with all this crud. So she really went on a pretty good rampage about how people should not have to die just because they're cooking. So a couple of things got put into place. The Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves at the UN got put together, and the EPA had an indoor air division developed, all about trying to end indoor cooking of wood. Now, there's two aspects to this. One is the health aspect, but the other is the deforestation aspect, because it turns out that the great majority, not just a little majority, of deforestation happens because people simply want to cook their food. So, timber harvest and all that for construction lumber is nothing compared to what we're talking about when it comes to cooking. So, we do a demonstration of how clean these stoves are versus using a fossil fuel or a wood source. On the Gaia Networks, one of the it's the Real Goods Company. So Gaia, they have a network and a story, a show called Beyond Belief with George Norrie, who's one of your colleagues. George Norrie has a big radio show. And we do on that television show an example of burning both fuels. And you'll see that the Pyrex bowl that's full of gasoline turns completely black with huge, foul clouds of smoke. And we burn alcohol next to it, no carbon in the bowl. You can almost not even see the flame, it's so clean. And those stoves are available for people to use for cooking around the world. And that stove was also in the in the TV clip. So so basically, we have the solution right there for 3.5 billion people to be able to cook and not die from cooking. And alcohol, unlike wood, is actually more convenient. See, in these places where people cook with wood, they end up walking eventually 5 or 6 hours one way to get 100 pounds of wood to bring back to their village and then use that for a week's worth of cooking. That's because all the other wood has already been harvested by people for cooking. It's like humans are like termites going out there eating the forest, right? So if you make alcohol, basically you're growing a sugary or starchy crop right where you live. Let's say it's like tapioca, which is a very common root crop all over the tropics, or maybe it's a little sugar cane, or maybe it's prickly pear cactus. Whatever grows well in your climate, you ferment it, which is just like making wine or beer. You mush up the stuff, you heat it up, and then you throw yeast in. The yeast eat the sugar, and they pee out alcohol. So when it gets up around 12 or 13% alcohol, well, the yeast keel over dead drunk. So now you've got wine. You've got a really weird brown wine, let's say, from prickly pear cactus. So you boil that up in a distillery, and you can make it 100% alcohol, depending on the technology. That's what you use for cooking or in your car or whatever. So if you're in a village, well, you grow some of this stuff, you make the alcohol, and then people use it. You can sell it if you're a little business, or if it's a cooperative, the whole village uses it. So the thing is, no one has to, and when I say no one, I mean all 1,000 people in the village don't have to forage out there 6 hours to get their wood. And that means they get to stay home. They get to do what they need to do for farming and everything else instead of this huge time sink to go out just to get cooking wood. And it's not dangerous. Can you imagine being a single woman going out to get 100 pounds of wood, walking 6 hours on a road in Africa? This is not safe, right. Okay? So basically, this affects half the world, and it's more important than our being able to drive our cars on 50 cent a gallon alcohol.
So this propaganda has definitely been effective, and today so much of global politics is about controlling oil. Are there any countries that still today run on alcohol, or have they all kind of fallen in line with this propaganda?
Well, up until World War II, most countries ran on alcohol because there was no way to deliver oil to them. The international tanker fleet wasn't in existence yet. So if you were somewhere like New Zealand, which is like the last stop before Antarctica, you weren't getting any oil delivered. And places like the Philippines, too far from any source of oil that was developed. So these places had to use alcohol. So in the New Zealand, they used sugar beets, which were a great source for alcohol. And they also used sorghum, which makes blackstrap molasses in the United States. Sorghum looks like corn and a little bit like sugar cane, and you can squeeze it to get the juice out and make kind of a whiskey from it. So those countries had to use those things. Up in the Philippines, they tapped nipa palm trees. So it was kind of like maple sugar tapping, And they got this huge flow of sugar water out of these trees, fermented and distilled that. And before World War II, the Philippines were making 75 million gallons of alcohol a year from palm drippings, okay? So this was done all over the world. Well, when World War II happened, that's when our tax dollars built the tanker fleet. And so then the oil companies could deliver all over the world and pretty much outcompeted alcohol because of all the subsidies that the oil companies received. Now, Brazil, up until World War II, was completely running on alcohol. They had sugar cane to beat the band. It went away after World War II for a while, but when the oil crisis of the late 70s came into play, unlike the other countries in Latin America, which borrowed money to buy oil, Brazil said none of that. And they had within one generation's memory of running the country on alcohol. So they went right back to it. And today, 95% of the cars in Brazil run on straight alcohol. And unlike the other countries in Latin America, they don't have any foreign debt. You know, when we lent money for something that gets used up almost instantly to Latin America, we put them in debt forever.
Right.
God. Do you think someone had a plan about that one? You know, so anyway, Brazil didn't, and Brazil is the powerhouse economy of Latin America. And, you know, depending on who you talk to, their economy might even be better than ours. So you know, and people in Brazil who grow sugarcane, they're unionized. It's the biggest union in Brazil, the sugarcane workers, and they get a fair shake, you know, because the whole country depends on them, not just for sugar, but for energy. So, you know, once you start empowering farmers with the energy production of this country, they suddenly get a voice because, you know, what they're providing is something people need. And that's what we all need, is organization and a voice in how things get done. I mean, that is the quaint idea of democracy, that we kind of have a say in how we get governed, you know? Mm-hmm. And the way you get that say is with economic power. Mm-hmm. And so producing energy, that's the way to do it.
Yeah, and this could clearly replace oils, but I mean, even in the era of nuclear meltdowns in Japan, could this go far enough to replace nuclear energy?
Absolutely. Nuclear energy in the U.S. is about 20% of our electricity. And then it's coal is the next big one, and natural gas. And then there's small parts that go to, you know, hydroelectric, which is clean, but controversial, and a little tiny bit of renewable energy. So what are the big numbers we got to replace? Well, it's coal and nuclear primarily. So in the United States, we have the potential, and the United States is a good case because we are the energy pigs of the world. We use about a quarter of all the energy in the world. So if you can replace it here, you can do it anywhere. So the United States, by switching up some of the crops it uses to make alcohol away from corn, which is a low yield alcohol crop, to ones that yield 3 or 10 times as much as corn, things like, again, sugar beets or sorghum, you know, things that are more productive per acre. We can replace not only all the nuclear power, and we could use the nuclear facilities because the turbines at those places work perfectly fine, but we could run them on alcohol instead, shut down the reactor. We could also replace all the coal. Wow, same thing. We could use all their equipment to produce electricity and shut down the coal boilers, you know. And we could also replace all the gasoline and diesel that run the vehicles. This is because alcohol is made from solar energy, which, as you might have noticed, falls everywhere. It doesn't just fall in this place or that place. You know, it's like you can't monopolize solar energy. So we can make alcohol with different crops, different plants, and waste products everywhere. It's about as democratic a fuel as you can get. But the quantities we can get, because the amount of energy that hits the earth from the sun is truly immense, instead of these little dinky monopolized energy supplies like, you know, coal and oil. So the whole world could actually be running on alcohol in as little as 10 years.
Huh. Wow. And it's you say it's a natural process. Let's talk about that a little bit, because obviously there's the alcohol you drink, and is the only difference between fuel and alcohol you would drink the strength of it?
That's right. It's the same stuff. Although when you make alcohol, it's not like your fine Pilsner beer, which you keep in a cave for 15 days so it ferments slowly and has great flavor. We ferment this stuff in like 1 to 3 days, and it's nasty. So as we say alcohol can be a gas, we say drink the best and then drive the rest. So, we don't recommend using this for a beverage, even though it's illegal, which wouldn't usually stop me from recommending it. But in this case, it tastes horrible. And that's all from the trace byproducts from the yeast poop. By controlling a lot of conditions and taking a longer time to ferment, you can make perfectly good sipping whiskey. But, we're not trying to do that. So alcohol is the very same stuff. It's just the byproducts that give flavor to the different kinds of liquor. So when it comes to making alcohol, it's pretty straightforward. We take the raw material. Let's say it's sugar cane or sorghum. We squeeze it to get the sugary juice out. And then we usually heat it up to sterilize it because we don't want to lose our alcohol to other organisms. And then we feed it to yeast, the same yeast that make wine or beer, actually, or even bread. That's the same yeast. They eat the sugar, as I said earlier, and they poop out the alcohol, and they breathe out CO2. And then we distill it into fuel. Now, I repeated that because I want to go back now to what makes the sugar or starch that we ferment. So alcohol, or I should say carbohydrates, are made from carbon dioxide, hydrate, which is water. So carbohydrates plants produce from carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. Sunlight is the power that glues together the carbon dioxide and water. So the resulting sugars are what we ferment, and what we end up with is liquid solar energy as a fuel. Now, how does that work? When you burn the alcohol in your car and you explode it to drive yourself down the road, what goes out the exhaust pipe is exactly what went in: carbon dioxide and water. What drives your car down the road is the exploding solar energy that's contained in the fuel. So you are literally driving on the sun when you burn alcohol in your car, and the carbon dioxide and water that you send out the exhaust pipe is exactly the amount of carbon dioxide and water you need to make next year's alcohol crop. So you have a cycle going there where you're not putting excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You are recycling it over and over again. So if you want to stop climate change, you got to stop burning fossil fuels. It doesn't matter if we have 1,000 years worth of natural gas. We'd be dead long before that 1,000 years if we keep burning that stuff. So we have to switch to something that doesn't add to the atmosphere, and alcohol is one of the few things that does that. Now, I wrote this book, Alcohol Can Be a Gas, to give activists and farmers and entrepreneurs the toolkit to be able to build their own equipment and start their own local cooperatives or businesses to be able to, give people the choice. And that's what it's all about, is choice, to not use gasoline. And I got to tell you, man, the first time you go to an alcohol station, and there are 2,500 in the United States, and you fill your car up with alcohol, and especially if you do it at home, when you fill up your car with alcohol, you not only screw the oil companies, but you also screw the IRS, because there are various states have various tax credits and stuff for using alcohol. And, there isn't a better day standing up than being able to screw the IRS and the oil companies.
I agree. 2 birds with 1 stone. But who knew it was so simple? And I guess to give people one example of how they could use this information, you have a pretty interesting story about how you went and used this information and partnered with a local donut shop near you to make alcohol, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, see, waste products are something we promote heavily in the book, The Alcohol Can Be a Gas book. And we even talk about it on our website with the same name. But when I lived in San Francisco, when I first started making alcohol, not exactly a place where you can find a lot of crops, So, but I figured donuts, what are they made of? They're made of starch, white flour, and they're made of sugar, lots of sugar. So I went to a donut shop, and, here I was 19, not exactly quite confident, that I could do this. And I went there with my pickup truck and some drums, and I said, well, maybe you guys would be okay with me, like, taking your waste donuts away. I could leave these drums here and you could fill them up. And the guy says, done. Costs us a lot to get rid of all the waste donuts. So I leave the drums there, figuring they'll call me in a week or two, and I'll pick up the donuts and I'll make alcohol in this little warehouse that I had rented. So the next morning at 6 a.m, I get a call and they say, they're full. So I went on down to the donut place. I take them away, spend like several hours that day figuring out how to make alcohol from them. Go home, exhausted, go to sleep. And at 6 o'clock the next morning, they call up and say, they're full. Oh, no. So I run down there. Now, you got to understand, there's one other thing that's in donuts, and that's fat, right? Because they're deep fried. Mm-hmm. So what I discovered that first day making the alcohol is that all the donut liquefied when I added my enzymes and my various potions, and it dissolved, but the fat floated on top. It was a foot thick, on top of my tank. So my fermentation tank. So I had to figure out what to do with it. So I looked at my compost pile and said, oh, okay, that's where it goes. And I had a nice big compost pile going. So I sprayed all the grease over the compost pile and mixed it in. And of course, the compost pile went, whoosh. I mean, it just started really getting hot and really, really going fast. It was great food for the microbes. So the second day I go there and I get all this stuff and I have a whole bunch of fat left over and I put it in the compost pile. But I'm thinking maybe I need a bigger compost pile. The third day I get there and I have all this fat and the compost pile's looking back up at me and it says, no, you don't. You don't put that stuff on me. I go, what am I going to do with all this fat? And thought about it. And, what I do in life is show people permaculture, which is permanent agriculture or permanent culture. And part of our concept is you look for surpluses that are not being used and find a use for them.
Right.
So I look at the surplus fat and I go, gosh, what am I going to do with this? Let's see, fat. 180,000 BTUs per gallon. That's a lot of energy. Then I look at my still burning wood for the heat. And I say, oh, I got it now. So I put a 55-gallon drum next to the still, and I plumbed a tube down into the firebox, and I threw all the fat in the drum, and I dripped it onto the firewood and treated the firewood like a wick in the bottom of my distillery, and I heated my whole process with the fat that came off the donut. So here was a feedstock for making alcohol that came with its own energy supply to distill itself. So I made alcohol for 10 cents a gallon from donuts, and I could do the same thing today.
Jeez. Yeah, that's an awesome story. And there's probably endless possibilities similar to that story that people could start doing to get creative and doing themselves, right?
Well, a lot of those stories are in my book, Alcohol Can Be a Gas, and they're not all my stories because I taught over 8,000 students how to make alcohol over a period of years. And of course, they'd all write me with their successes. So a lot of the sidebars next to the text, the little stories there, are stories of me and my students doing all these creative things in our communities to make alcohol.
That's awesome. So let's talk a little more about using alcohol as a fuel for our cars. There's a lot of myths out there perpetuated by the big oil industry that have everyone confused on the issue. Give us the facts on cars today. Could we just walk out and pour alcohol in our tanks without damaging the car?
The answer is partially yes. And you got to remember that cars first ran on alcohol. So gasoline is the afterthought, right? And so from every basic point of view, alcohol works great in a car. But, car materials have changed, somewhat since the early part of the century. So basically what it comes down to is your car is now run by a computer instead of a carburetor. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, before 1980, most cars had an air-fuel mixing device called a carburetor. So air rushed through it, fuel was sprayed into it basically, and it mixed on its way to the engine. Now today, we have fuel injection, which puts a squirt of fuel in front of every cylinder in a very specific timing, and it's all controlled by a computer. And the reason why is to get things perfect so it has low emissions. And it's a great system. But what we do is look at that computer and say, how smart is it? How much can it adjust the air-fuel mixture? Well, it turns out that virtually every car can run 50% alcohol without a single change to the engine.
Wow.
So I just want to make that clear. You can get rid of half of your oil swill with alcohol without changing anything in your engine. So now, why is that significant? If you look at where we get oil nowadays, 30%, only 30% of our oil comes from the Middle East. So that means if we just switch to 30% alcohol, we wouldn't have to change anything about all the cars in the United States, and we would eliminate the need for Mideast oil, and therefore having troops there, bases there, any of that stuff, which is hundreds of billions of dollars a year, out of our tax dollars. So we could leave the Middle East alone.
Right.
And would have all the fuel we need and never worry about a cutoff from those guys and not participate in their darn religious wars. You know, let them settle it out themselves.
Oh, man. It would work out so great for almost everyone, just except for the few people who hold the reins to actually make the change happen.
Well, all the military contractors would cry bloody murder because they're making, gazillions of dollars off the so-called war and terrorism in the Middle East.
Right. Man, this is such great information because I've seen ethanol at the pump, I think E15, and I've just been afraid to use it. I thought I'd need something special, and I just got spooked out.
Well, you're spooked out because in the background, in the back of your unconscious, you've heard thousands of media hits about how alcohol is bad for your car. It's invisible. You can't point to why you feel that way. You can't point to an article or whatever. It's a saturation of the media. Every day there's a negative alcohol story out there. They're all fabricated by the American Petroleum Institute. So, it's like the Wizard of Oz. Don't look at the man behind the curtain. If you look there, you'd see alcohol, right? Mm-hmm. And alcohol would be dangerous because it would change the balance of power in the United States. So basically, alcohol is not harmful to any material in a car since 1983. Now, my buddy Tom Harvey and I, we went into the Ford Motor plant in the Rouge plant in Detroit, and we went through that factory with the permission to film the assembly line, assembly, so to speak, of the fuel system. Mm-hmm. So we were there to see what different parts are used for alcohol tolerant trucks, the flex fuel trucks that can run on both alcohol or gas, or gasoline alone. So we go down the assembly line, starting at the gas tank, which oil companies say, oh, alcohol will eat the plastic of your gas tank and there'll be holes in it, And we talk to the forklift driver who's loading these gas tanks right onto the chassis of the trucks. And we ask him, well, which one is the special alcohol resistant gas tank? And he looks at us and says, that stack is for the 150s, that stack is for the 250s, and that's for the 350s. And we go, well, where's the alcohol stack? He goes, they aren't in there. There's no such thing, okay? Mm-hmm. And by the way, all this information we gave to the producers of the movie Pump, and all this has been repeated in the movie, so it's going to go out to more people. But at any rate, we went on to the next thing. We went on to the fuel pump that they drop into the tank. And we said, well, there's 3 bins here. It says 150, 250, 350. Where's the bin for the flex fuel pumps? Because the oil companies say it'll destroy your fuel pump. Guy says, these are the 3 bins. This is all we put in. And we went through the whole fuel system this way. We get to the fuel lines that go on the frame up to the fuel injectors in the engine. And, I say, well, the oil companies say that those fuel lines have to be stainless steel or alcohol will eat them up. And the guy says, this is mild steel, and this is all the fuel lines we use, including the flex fuel vehicles. So we get to the end, and we asked the shift supervisor who was, escorting us through the plant, and we said, so what is the difference between a truck that can run on both alcohol and gas and one that can only run on gas? He goes, well, it's software. We just have a little different software in the chip that gives us a wider range of air-fuel mixtures than the normal chip does. And it costs us about $20, $30 in development cost per chip to do that. So the difference between a vehicle that'll run on 100% alcohol and gasoline, or just gasoline, is just a few dollars on the assembly line. So it was really funny, though. Tom and I pack up and we say thank you, and we get out of there because we suspected somebody would figure out that maybe we shouldn't be filming this, And we're driving down the road as we leave, and, they call Tom, the shift supervisor says, gee, do you think you could bring that tape back? I'm not sure I was supposed to say all those things. And Tom said, oh, no, of course not. We're not bringing it back, and you don't have to worry. You didn't say anything too damaging. So,
wow.
So anyway, yeah, we got that tape. We want to edit that one together and put that out about, all the stuff they say about how your car is destroyed by alcohol is a complete and total lie. And it just doesn't happen. Now, what's the real truth? Propaganda, the way propaganda works, is not only is it untrue, but usually the opposite is true. And so we end up with a situation where you've got mechanics and press saying alcohol will wreck your car. But the opposite is true. Alcohol burns clean, as we mentioned earlier. It's actually so pollution-free, it doesn't even show up on most pollution test equipment. And that means there's no carbon in your engine. Your oil never turns black. It burns cooler than gasoline. These things all add up to tripling engine life. So not only is it not true that alcohol wrecks your car, the real truth is it triples engine life. Gosh, do you think there might be someone who's upset about that?
Right.
And so, the propaganda runs thick around alcohol.
Yeah, and in the consumer culture and capitalism, planned obsolescence is definitely a pillar of how a lot of these big companies work, and that is making sure that products are going to break down, a lot sooner than they need to, so that you have to go out and get that new product.
Well,
and this falls right in line with that.
They break down 1 month after your warranty's expired.
Right, of course.
No, actually, in defense of the car companies, I have to say that planned obsolescence, which was a strategy in the 70s to make cars break down after 2 or 3 years so you'd buy a new one, that's pretty gone. People have caught on to that one. And now what do you see? You see people looking at consumer reports to see how much repair you need over the time you run the car. So when I look at American cars today, especially Ford, we're looking at very, very well engineered cars. Now, there's an exciting development, which is Cummins. Now, Cummins is generally credited with being a diesel engine manufacturer. But since alcohol is 105 octane compared to gasoline being 87, that means you can squeeze the alcohol mixture much more before you fire it than you can gasoline. If you do it to gasoline in a diesel type engine, the gasoline just explodes from being squeezed too much because it has such a low octane rating. So Cummins has gone out there and taken their heavy-duty diesel engines and developed an alcohol-only engine that makes use of that extra strength engine, and they're getting better mileage, more power, and it's being done at half the size of the normal diesel engine. So a 2.9 liter engine is having the same horsepower or more as a 6.2 liter diesel engine. So the alcohol engine is smaller, lighter, uses less materials, gets better mileage, and more power, and virtually no pollution. So Cummins is making them right now for delivery trucks and that kind of thing. They're about to start selling them, but they intend to extend the line upwards and downwards to full-size diesel trucks, which would then be alcohol trucks, and all the way down to cars, because, Cummins is the biggest diesel engine manufacturer in the world, and they have now taken the suggestions from people like myself and other engineers to make dedicated alcohol engines, and those engines will last 1 million or 2 million miles rather than 100,000 miles.
Man, another thing that you're doing, you might have already done it, is opening an education facility in California. Is that still going on? Can you tell us about that?
Oh, yeah. We bought a great piece of property in near Santa Cruz. Our distillery is almost done, and we'll have classes there in the future in how to make alcohol fuel. We have 5 acres of greenhouses. So we'll be able to show different energy crops from around the world. Like in arid areas, it'll be mesquite and buffalo gourd and prickly pear cactus and the like. And then in marshy areas, we'll show cattails to alcohol. So all this will be going on at our Blume distillation site in Watsonville. And there will be tours and there will be workshops on how to make alcohol with 60,000 gallon per year sized equipment right there on the campus. And we'll have a lot of other events too. We have a big performance space we built there, and we'll be able to bring in important lecturers. And you can find all about this at either one of our 2 websites. One is Alcohol Can Be a Gas. That's the name of the book and the website. Alcohol Can Be a Gas. And then we have a new website that has to do with our distillery manufacturing company, where we're building stills for around the world for everything from coffee berry pulp to bananas to cactus to agave from the tequila areas. In other words, these places all have waste that we're going to be building distilleries to process, and that's Blume Distillation. So they work because I put my name on it, and you know exactly where to chase me if it doesn't work. So you can find that at bloomdistillation.com.
Very cool. And it's kind of a weird question, but I am a conspiracy guy. Do you ever worry about your safety talking about this stuff? It can be pretty dangerous to mess with the profits of these shady industries. Have you seen anybody get hurt or had any problems yourself?
I was in New Zealand once, and this big Maori guy in the back of the room, I was talking about alcohol in New Zealand, and they have kind of a Caribbean accent there. Mm-hmm. So he gets up and says, "I don't get why you haven't been killed yet." And so I said to the crowd, "Well, if anybody sees a red dot form on my forehead, will you please let me know?" But in reality, Greg, because I have my book, Alcohol Can Be a Gas, out there, if they kill me, can you imagine what that would do to my book sales?
Right, it validates it.
Well, in other words, suddenly many more people would be reading about it. But if they were going to kill me, they should have done it before I wrote the book. So now I feel pretty protected,
Right. Well, that's a good answer. So, man, I had no idea how important this stuff was or how easy it was. Before hearing you, I was just a total victim of the manipulation in this area, and I'm so glad you came here to clarify the subject. 2 weeks ago, it seemed so confusing. Now it seems so simple. But before we really called in, would you like to give people a little extra info about anything you're doing, the website, or maybe where they can catch this new movie coming out?
Well, the premiere is happening this weekend in the evening, Friday and Saturday night. So feel free to come to that. And that's in Santa Monica at the Civic Center at the L'Omelette Royale Theater. And, and Saturday we're having a performance at 3 o'clock at the Alt Car Expo, which is also in Santa Monica. So, we hope to see you out there. Because if you think the stuff that we're talking about is exciting, wait till you see us in real life battling it out with the electric car guys. We're also shooting over to Santa Fe for those of you who are over in that part of the country. Friday the 26th, we're going to be doing a premiere for the same movie, Pump. So you should go to their website. And we're also going to be in Washington, D.C. on the 10th of October doing the same thing. So we are out there making a lot of noise about this movie because it totally indicts the oil companies for conspiracy.
Right on. Well, David, this has been a real pleasure. They say knowledge is power, and you just gave us the oil industry's kryptonite, man. So thanks again. Thanks for all you're doing. You're a real champion of the people. So take care of yourself out there.
Will do.
All right, man. Have a good one.
You too.
There we have it, folks. An interesting examination into a huge sector of manipulation, and I hope we all escaped with a clear understanding of how this stuff really works, and I hope we're all starting to make some strides towards denting the Rockefeller and Bush family pocketbooks and providing these dicks with less capital in which to reinvest in more manipulative media. And maybe we've come up with some new business ideas. How cool would that be? Start making your own alcohol and educating your friends and family, and this could really be something. I'm all jazzed up about it. And if you liked this show and you only heard the free version, you can get that second hour at the HighersideChatsPlus.com. It's only $5 a month, less than you tip your bartender or pizza man. And thanks to the folks who are subscribing to keep the show alive and keep me employed working for you guys, trying to bring interesting, empowering, and